how exactly does a tree become a table? I mean, it seems like a pretty simple question, right? But the journey of that standard, everyday piece of furniture, it actually reveals the invisible scaffolding of the entire global economy. By tracking its path, we can literally map out the core DNA of how businesses operate and how nations build wealth.
So here's today's boardroom agenda. We've got 4 items on the docket. First, the 3 business sectors. Second, why economic sectors change. Third, the mixed economy explained. And finally, public versus private ownership. Let's dive in.
All right, Section 1, the 3 business sectors. These sectors are basically the 3 foundation buckets that categorize literally every single business activity on Earth. Think about the journey of our wooden table. We don't just magically get a table, do we? It moves through 3 distinct stages of production, starting with a woodcutter in the forest, then moving on to the furniture maker in a workshop or factory, and finally ending up at the retailer who sells it to you. Each one of these steps represents a totally different sector of the economy. Let's break them down starting right at the source. The primary sector consists of businesses involved in extracting the Earth's natural resources. So if you're taking something directly from the planet, you're in the primary sector. This is your woodcutter harvesting timber, farmers growing crops, fishing fleets, and massive mining operations extracting copper ore or, drilling for oil. It is the absolute starting line of the economy. Next up, we have the secondary sector. These are the businesses that take those raw materials from the primary sector and convert them into manufactured or processed goods. Now, putting on my CEO hat for a second, this is where massive value is added. We aren't just selling a raw log anymore, right? We're cutting it, sanding it, and assembling it into a beautiful table. This sector covers everything from building and construction to computer assembly, car manufacturing, and even baking bread. And finally, we reach the tertiary sector. This is the service realm. These businesses provide services to both consumers and to other businesses. The retailer selling you that table, they sit right here. But it also includes banking, insurance, transport, hotels, and even hairdressing. They aren't extracting raw goods or manufacturing physical items, they're providing essential services. Now take a look at these concentric rings connecting the sectors. They are completely 100% interdependent. A tertiary business, like, say, a travel agent, relies heavily on secondary businesses, like aircraft manufacturers, to actually build the planes. And those aircraft manufacturers, well, they rely entirely on primary businesses to extract the metal ores from the Earth. It's like a giant puzzle. You just can't have the outer rings without the core. Okay, moving on to Section 2, why economic sectors change. Let's zoom out a bit from the individual product level to the macroeconomic level and look at how entire nations evolve over time. When we analyze global economies, we typically see a really clear pattern. Developing economies often have a huge percentage of their workers employed in the primary sector, meaning they rely heavily on agriculture and raw natural resources. But as a country becomes an economically developed nation, we see a massive shift. The vast majority of the workforce actually transitions into the tertiary sector, providing services. To put that into perspective, let's compare some 2017 national output data. Notice how Papua New Guinea gets 35% of its output from the primary sector. They are incredibly rich in mineral deposits like copper and gold, plus timber. But then look at India. Their primary sector is much smaller in terms of output at just 17%, while their tertiary sector is absolutely booming at 57%. India strategically positioned itself as a global powerhouse for IT services, which drives that massive tertiary number. This kind of shift often leads us to a really important concept in economics called deindustrialization. This is the decline in the importance of the manufacturing or secondary sector of industry in a country. For example, in the UK, ever since the 1970s, manufacturing has shrunk significantly as they lost competitiveness to newly industrialized nations. Today, the tertiary sector in the UK employs well over 75% of all workers. To truly grasp how dramatic this evolution can be, let's look at the epic data story of Bangladesh. Back in 1970, a massive 53% of their GDP came from the primary sector, mostly agriculture. People were essentially farming just to survive. But fast forward to 2017, primary drops way down to 15%. Secondary manufacturing, specifically food processing and clothing, nearly doubles to 29%. And tertiary jumps up to 56%, driven by telecommunications and finance. That right there is the statistical footprint of a nation rapidly modernizing. And this brings us to one of my all-time favorite examples to discuss in lectures, South Korea.
In the 1950s, their economy was highly dependent on farming. Fast forward to 2017, and agriculture is just 4% of their output. Manufacturing is at a robust 42%, and services lead the whole shebang with 54%. So, why does this happen? Well, as a country's total wealth increases and living standards rise, consumers spend a much higher proportion of their incomes on services, like travel and restaurants, rather than just basic manufactured goods. It's really a natural evolution of consumer wealth.
Which leads us to Section 3, the mixed economy explained. So, we've spent a lot of time talking about what is being produced. Now, we've got to ask the critical boardroom question: who actually owns and controls these businesses? Because beyond the activity itself, we must also classify businesses by ownership. Nearly every country in the world operates what we call a mixed economy. This means ownership is split between two distinct forces: the private sector and the public sector. And that brings us to Section 4, public versus private ownership. Diving into the conflicting strategies of these two models, here's the absolute core difference. The private sector consists of businesses owned by private individuals. They make their own decisions on what to produce, what to charge, and their primary driving objective is to make a profit. The public sector, on the other hand, consists of organizations owned and controlled by the government or state. Their money comes from taxpayers, and their primary objective isn't necessarily profit at all, but rather providing a service to the citizens. Think about it: health, education, defense, water, and electricity supply. As an economics lecturer, I love posing this strategic rhetorical question to my class. Why would a government want to own a hospital or a water supply, but not a smartphone factory? Well, it comes down to public welfare. Governments step in to ensure everyone has access to essential, life-sustaining services, regardless of their ability to pay those high profit margins. But this balance isn't static, it changes. Recently, many governments have engaged in privatization. This is the act of selling public sector businesses to the private sector. We've seen this happen across Europe and Asia with water supplies, electricity grids, and public transport systems. Governments do this hoping to inject some of that private sector efficiency to control costs and to introduce competition to improve quality. Now, of course, in the boardroom, we always have to weigh the pros and cons. The benefits of privatization are pretty clear. Profit motives drive efficiency, and private owners often invest much more capital into the business than a cash-strapped government can afford. However, the societal risks are very real. To cut costs and boost profits, a private business might fire workers, leading to major job losses. Furthermore, they're far less likely to focus on social objectives if it hurts their bottom line. Let's look at a really beautiful, real-world example of this mixed economy in action: the island nation of Mauritius. Their economy is absolutely dominated by the tertiary sector, specifically tourism. Now, massive private global hotel chains operate all over the island to capture profit. That's the private sector doing its thing. But the national airline, Air Mauritius, which physically brings those tourists in, is partly owned by private investors and partly owned by the Mauritian government. The state maintains a stake there to ensure the strategic lifeline of their entire tourism industry is secure. We've traveled all the way from raw timber in a forest to the complex ownership structures of global airlines. The architecture of business is truly all around you. So I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to consider today. Look closely at your own country's economy. Between the safety nets of the public sector and the relentless innovation of private enterprise, is the balance of power right for your future? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.